All right, good morning, everyone. I've been asked to take a bit of an economic perspective, or present a bit of an economic perspective on this. And as earlier speakers have suggested, the trade debate has certainly been the focus of our attention, and sometimes I think to the detriment of real solutions. So it's a little bit like those of you who are a bit older when we're at university, if you can remember those capitalism versus communism debates. It's of that kind of ilk. So highly simplistic, and it's sort of a two-camp approach, and the two camps often don't talk to each other. So I want to try and move this debate forward a little bit. Now, I am going to start out just by reiterating some of what you already know. So we know the poaching numbers have been there, and we've got the population numbers. If we add the poached numbers on top, we see perhaps what could have been, except of course there's also an added impact, because when you kill the rhino, you're also effectively killing the potential offspring from those rhino. So the population has leveled off. And if we look at the value of the rhinos poached, and this is simply based on the live sale price, so the axis on the left showing those values up to about 370 odd million rand, and an estimate based on a sort of projection for 2014 of slightly more than that. And then if we look at the impact of this on effectively the loss of the value of the national herd, then you're looking at annual losses that are now exceeding 5% per annum. I looked into retail trade, and if you look at global retail trade, the average losses to shrinkage, which is euphemistically accounts for all sorts of things, including criminal activities, it's about 1.4%. Most commercial businesses would not be able to sustain a 5% annual loss and stay in business for very long. Okay, in terms of the rhino horn supply chain, I mean, I think the important point to note here is that actually these criminal syndicates are really logistics operations. They move product. And the poachers are effectively outsourced subcontractors, if you like. And then you go through various middlemen, and you've got a port export. On the high seas, these things can change ownership numerous times. So it's all designed. Even in sort of commercial trade, you have a lot of ownership change of a container on the high seas. So while it's moving across the oceans, ownership continually getting changed. And the same kind of thing can happen here. So the important point that adds, as Sam noted, is that with globalization, we've seen huge increases in the volume of trade being moved around the world. So I often in my economics lectures point to the fact that back in 1960, only about 3% of products produced in the world ever moved across an international border. And today we're up to about a third. And that equates to, just on the sea tonnages, last year about 9.4 billion tons. So if you are trying to, or if you want to hide a bit of rhino horn in amongst that lot, then it is a bit like looking for a particular grain of sand in the desert. Okay, the other point to note here, though, is that as you move along this chain, increasingly you're interacting with formal, legitimate, and real economy. So the distributors are often moving product with legitimate articles, and that's what makes it even harder to track down and address. So in terms of Sam's suggestions about disrupting these networks, I think it's an important point, but we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of doing that. Okay, so if we look at drivers for the demand for horn, some of this has already been raised, but I'm just taking a slightly different tack here. From my perspective, the most significant driver of the increased demand for horn has been growth in incomes in the major consumer markets in East Asia, and this graph really shows that. So the red line here is indicating Chinese per capita real GDP growth. So in effect, between 1990 and 2013, the average Chinese person's real incomes rose by about 680%. Over the same period, average Vietnamese individuals' real incomes rose by about 250%. And you can see that the price trend, I have to just caution that I didn't have a lot of data to work with here. So this is a sort of extrapolation between two fairly disparate points. But the price trend sort of tracks the Vietnamese income, and then from about 2008 onwards, you see some divergence, and it's almost as if things are happening in China perhaps that are pulling up or having a bigger impact on prices in the marketplace. And that certainly seems to be consistent with what we've seen from or heard from other information. The Chinese demand has been picking up, particularly in the southern provinces. Okay, so the central thesis from an economic perspective is that we've got a whole lot of drivers for demand, and all of them are actually pushing demand outwards and upwards. So significantly, the demand for the income forces are shifting demand outwards. Then we add in population growth. So over the next 5 years, the populations in China and Vietnam will increase by about 34 million people. So then you add preferences. We know that in Vietnamese markets and things, there are new uses being invented for rhino horn. So that adds to the willingness to want to buy it. And then in addition, there's this kind of banking on extinction process, which leads to speculators wanting to build up stockpiles, knowing that the price is likely to go up and that they can sell it in future for a profit. So all of these things point to outward shifts in demand. And the question then is, what weapons do we have to try to correct this or offset those effects? All right, if we look at the volume of horn poached from South Africa, so this is just converting the number of animals poached into the kilograms of horn, roughly, and then we contrast the price. I don't think we can make the assumption that there's been this sudden growth in demand in consumer states, because over this period, these values have risen by about 23% a year. But what has happened is that previously, a lot of the quantities being supplied to the market were coming from other range states and other sources like museum collections, etc. And now those are no longer easy to access or viable. And so South Africa, with its significant rhino population, is bearing the brunt of that problem. But there are other factors that have made us a more attractive destination. So the things like systemic corruption within South Africa, the fact that we are a bigger, more integrated integrated economy into the global economy, makes it easier for criminal networks to operate in our environment as well. On the supply side, I guess the biggest risk is that we could see the entry of new criminal syndicates into this market. So we know that they are relatively few in number, but if you were to get new syndicates entering the market, you could also end up developing new markets geographically elsewhere in the world, which would exacerbate the problem. Okay, so again, the question is, what are the weapons that we have to address potential illegal supply expansion? Now, the next speaker, I think, is going to address some of the modeling exercises they've done. But it's interesting that in a model that I built, which is a little bit more simplistic, when you just extend the kind of status quo interventions, then you do end up, as Pelham has indicated, with a sort of extinction event. Now, in reality, it's not this is quite an unlikely scenario, because as the numbers reduce, you would concentrate them, and so, but you might end up with a kind of pre-operation rhino sort of numbers again. So a lot of the progress on recent years would be foregone. Okay, so what are we doing? Well, we've got demand reduction efforts. The problem, of course, here is that there's very little indication that in a range of areas that there's very limited success in changing consumer behavior when consumers don't want to change. And there are all sorts of prerequisites for having a successful demand reduction process. There have been some examples in relation to rhinos, but our concern is that some of the success factors that drove those in Japan, for example, or Taiwan, in Korea, might not be present in China or Vietnam. The other point to note, though, is that you have to be very successful before you even start to make a dent. So if these other almost exogenous drivers of demand that are pushing it outwards are allowed to continue over the next 5 years, then your demand reduction efforts have to literally be successful in reducing demand by 33% or thereabouts just to stand still. Okay, so from that perspective, it's important, but we also have to accept that it's going to take time, and it might not be as successful as we'd like. And then, of course, our other attempts are effectively at raising the costs of supply to the criminal networks through our anti-poaching and security efforts. So far, those things, literally, we still have about 4,800 kilograms of rhino horn in the market. So this is where the trade proposal really comes in. The argument is that if you now introduce legal supply, so that you peg back the illegal criminal networks over here, you have you add your legal supply, so the supply curve shifts outwards. In effect, that drops the price slightly, and then the legal supply accounts for this quantity of demand, and the illegal supply for that quantity. So in effect, you are saving the equivalent number of rhinos from extinction, or from killing rather. The critical questions that emerge from this now are, all right, so what happens to the funds that are generated here? And how those get used is quite important to how successful and sustainable these efforts are in the future. Our ultimate objective, though, as Pelham has indicated at the end of his talk, is that we have to make somehow the value of live animals more significant than they are relative to the value of a dead animal. And this highlights the value of a dead rhino to the criminal syndicates using this sort of price of the horn. So I've converted to about 4.4 kilos average per animal, because that's the average weight of the horns in our stockpiles. And you contrast that with the live sale price and the trophy price from hunting, and you can see there's a huge gap here. And that creates this ongoing incentive for us to have poachers and criminal syndicates active in this market. So what we need to do is try and change the value capture model by effectively allowing some of these benefits to go to the owners and conservers of rhino. Of course, we do have the CITES challenge, and there's a number of hurdles we have to cross. So addressing concerns from other range states and being able to support our arguments so that we can get sufficient buy-in from the other members. Then we have to identify trade partners, and then there are going to have to be legislative changes in both the exporting and consumer markets. Problem, of course, here is this is politics with a very big P, and so it means that there are inevitably going to become, or there's potential for trade-offs and long negotiations. All right, but Okay, it's fine for us to talk about a legal trade model, but how that model is structured is actually especially important to the kind of outcomes we can expect. So on the supply side, whatever model we choose, we have to make sure that we don't allow legally sourced horn to enter that legal stream. This is a bit like a laundering of criminal gains. Whatever we do must be sustainable. So the idea of one-off sales and things are just absolutely disastrous. What we have to do, and you'll see when we talk about demand here, we have to reassure those consumers in Vietnam and China and wherever else they might ultimately be that they will continue to be able to source that product into the future. Because importantly, that will reduce the desire to stockpile. At the moment, households in Vietnam and China stockpile because a small piece of horn, 100 grams or something, could last them 10 years. But if they're concerned about whether they can get the horn in future, they would be more inclined, affordability constraints aside, to want to have a whole horn or a few horns at their disposal. Continuity of supply into the future will also largely eliminate the speculative demand for horn, because as long as the price is not certain to keep going up in the future, then speculators might leave the market. Okay, it's got to generate additional resources to fund anti-poaching and disruption efforts. So how the money gets used is important. And then picking up on Sam's point as well, we need to spread the benefits, not just to an elite few, but to neighboring communities. It's important that it doesn't, whatever systems and processes we have in place, don't impose substantial compliance costs on the distributors, because otherwise they'll just go back to the illegal suppliers. It'll be cheaper for them. And then ideally we don't want to allow the process to develop, initially at least anyway, new geographical markets. Okay, so from the perspective of structures and institutions, if we allow a structure to focus purely on a kind of profit maximization model, then we are probably going to encourage intensive farming of rhino and over extensive management, because the marginal cost will be reduced and profits would rise. We'd need some kind of central registration and DNA certification process. We'd need to have regular auctions. So this idea of one minute stockpiles being certified and allowing certified products onto the market would be important. And then other factors that are important, that one of the challenges with the CSO type structure could be that it acts as a gatekeeper, so only certain suppliers can now sell their horn and others can't, and that wouldn't be desirable. You want the price to be able to work, so you might have quotas on what can be supplied, but you can't have a price setting process per se. And you'd also not want to have to sell to a single buyer, ideally. Okay. The other point about the criminal supply chains is that we might have to consider literally trying to legalize some elements of that supply chain, perhaps at the retail end where the margins are not necessarily that high. I'm talking about the end retailer, or but at the same time we want to replace other aspects of that chain with alternatives. Okay, I think I'll just conclude with the fact that because this impact is potentially significant, we need to give more careful consideration to these structures, and we can't undertake legal trade as an experiment. Once we move in that direction, we're in it for good. Okay, thanks.